Thank you very much, everybody, for helping set this up. Very much welcome to all of you, and especially to Francesca. It's her second time on Digit Debate, so we're very pleased to have you back again. The last time Francesca came and presented her book in collaboration with the SARSE on lives of Black women, digital lives of Black women in Britain, and we really enjoyed that contribution. And today, Francesca is going to be presenting her work from an innovation-funded project, looking at how Black and Asian workers negotiate racism in cultural and creative industries. And we'll hear more about some of the really recent innovative work Francesca's been doing. So with no further ado, Francesca, thank you very much for coming and talking to us. And we look forward to hearing about your research. I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just to say thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of today and welcome me back once again. I'm going to hopefully share my screen in a moment because I've got some slides to just talk through, and generally what I'm hoping is that today will be a bit of a brief overview of this collaborative project, which will involve me speaking a little bit about some of the key findings that came through from it, in addition to sharing some of what was involved in doing the work itself. And then I'm happy to have a conversation, and would also love to hear about the work that other people are doing as part of today too. So this collaborative research, it really focused on how cultural workers address racism and work in the digital age. And when we're speaking about cultural workers, we're using that term quite broadly. It really relates to different forms of work that is part of what is often referred to as the creative and cultural industries, or the cultural and creative industries, also sometimes known as the CCIs. And with this particular project, we were especially focusing on the different ways that Black, Asian, and other people of colour make use of digital media, social media, and online platforms as part of how they pursue paid work, but also as part of the different ways that they might address racism. So to really sort of start things going in a moment, if these slides manage to make a move. As I mentioned, this is collaborative work, and I'm sharing some key points from it today, but it goes without saying that this is far from being a solo endeavor. So I had the opportunity to work with fantastic colleagues, and we also had the opportunity to work alongside a brilliant research assistant for a period of time as well. And much of what I'll be talking about today is discussed in more detail as part of both an open access article in the journal The Sociological Review, and a brief open access report that we've put together, which is beautifully illustrated by Chris Manson, whose work you can find out more from Chris's website, which is linked in the report. And this work, it was 2020 to 2021 that we were really focusing on this. And it's worth me highlighting that that's the particular context, because of course, when we think about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, that very much has had, a significant impact on a whole host of different sectors and industries. And of course, that includes the creative and cultural industries. That said, this wasn't a project focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on this, these sectors and the people who work within them, but we noted that the particular forms of precarity that were very pervasive around those times absolutely related to some of the different ways that people were turning to digital tools, social media, forms of digital presence as part of how they navigated work and tried to secure paid work at a time when it was especially difficult to do so in some cases. So I'd also just like to briefly take this opportunity to, express our gratitude in relation to the funding that we received, and to thank Digit for the support that was provided throughout as well. This is a visual, which is the cover of the report that I just spoke about, which again was wonderfully illustrated by Chris Manson. And I guess each of these visuals in some ways, or some different ways, points to some of the issues that we were focusing on with this research, whether that is the different forms of online abuse and harassment that people were facing, and how different approaches to digital presence or digital disengagement were part of how individuals tried to address that. Or in other cases, thinking about the fact that these digital platforms and these different digital spaces are neither inherently good nor inherently bad. So, alongside the forms of inequality, the forms of abuse that people discussed, there were many examples of moments where connection or a sense of community was made possible, or was at least sort of bolstered by the use of certain online platforms, complicating any binary notions of digital culture or digital platforms as simply great or simply awful. So on this slide, I just shared a few of the many different words that people expressed when they were interviewed as part of this research project. Here, I'll just briefly mention that this project predominantly focused on interviews with Black, Asian and other people of colour in the creative and culture industries in Britain. And we did 30 interviews, and those interviews were with people based in many different places within Britain, across England, Scotland, Wales, and in many different roles. So, some people perhaps had a permanent position for a specific organisation, other people were solely freelance, some people were currently in paid work, other people weren't. But these few words, I think, just to maybe share one of these speech bubbles, now we can talk about it, racism, as much as we want on social media, but the real world is where things get changed. And I think maybe just to sort of sit with these few words, I think that apart from the fact that this person's experience clearly highlighting sort of the limitations of what perhaps is or is not possible on social media, it also alludes to the fact that there can still be these ideas of social media as existing in a sort of somewhat disconnected space, removed from the real world. And as part of the critical research that we do, of course, we challenge that notion. Social media exists in the world. And, if we're speaking about reality as being constructed, it's both constructed in terms of how people experience the digital and experience spaces that aren't online. But that aside, I think it's also very telling that what came through from some of the research interviews were these views that sort of question the extent to which these digital spaces feel reflective of the reality of what's going on offline, and question the extent to which forms of resistance or forms of activism online in relation to the creative and culture industries always translates into offline changes or forms of improvement to address issues of inequality. So to sort of start to wrap up this introduction, these were the sorts of questions that we were dealing with as part of this project. How are Black, Asian and other people of colour, who we refer to in this case as creators of colour, whilst also recognising the limitations of such terms, in Britain's culture and creative industries, using digital platforms to produce and circulate acts of creativity in ways that might enable them to access paid work? To what degree do creators of colour intend for such uses of digital platforms to counter and combat racism in the CCIs, including its intersections with other forms of oppression, such as sexism, misogyny, classism, xenophobia, and ableism? And how do the affordances of those digital communication technologies that people are using both enable and constrain creators of colour in their efforts to reach and build audiences and combat racism and interconnected oppressions? At this point, I just reiterate that whilst we make use of this term creators of colour, we're very mindful of distinct differences between the experiences of people who might be viewed as people of colour. With regards to that, as part of our research, including as is hopefully conveyed in our article in Sociological Review, we speak about some of the specifics of different forms of oppression, whether that is the specifics of anti-Blackness or the intersections of racism and sexism, and also just being cognizant of the fact that even if individuals might be viewed as being part of a broader demographic known as people of colour, there are many experiences that will differ between those various individuals. On the right side of this slide is a very brief explanation of some of the key themes that emerged from the conversations that we had with people. So these tended to cluster around forms of digital community and solidarity, also moments and experiences that related to algorithms, issues to do with visibility, the oppressive nature of algorithms, to draw on the phenomenal work of Safia Mojanobo, and also matters to do with digital presence and safety. So all of this meant that we were really grappling with different power dynamics that relate to experiences of publicness and also privacy, which I'll speak a bit more about shortly. Our research was shaped by a broad range of literature and scholarly approaches, but this included the foundational work of scholar and public intellectual Stuart Hall, including the different ways that Hall has explored the relationship between power, culture, and politics. How power struggles play out discursively and materially in different forms of creativity and cultural production. And this also meant that we spent time reflecting on different meanings and associations that relate to words such as creativity, culture, artist, and value, and how systems of value are implicated in the different ways that the work of Black, Asian, and people of colour is or is not supported and credited within this industry or these industries. So on that note, again, just to really emphasize, whilst we were focusing predominantly on issues to do with racism, we were very much, intentional in ensuring that we were taking an intersectional approach to how we understand and address the ways that inequality and power dynamics play out. So we were thinking a lot about, issues to do with racial capitalism more generally, and we were also just reflecting on the fact that, of course, there's an extensive body of research and evidence that points to these inequalities and the fact that they are societal in nature. They're not just specific to these industries. But within these industries, there is ample evidence to sort of emphasize the point that consistently, many organizations within the CCIs, they're predominantly white, predominantly middle class in nature, and often it is men who are occupying the most senior, secure, and high paid roles. So I share this to give a sense of the industry-wide context that the individuals we interviewed are dealing with. This also meant thinking quite a lot about space and place, so the geographies of these industries. So we were mindful of the fact that, as well as being shaped by the physical location of where people live and work, be that locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, people's experiences of pursuing paid work in the creative and culture industries can be impacted by many different digital spaces, internet technologies, and platforms, and that all of this is very much entangled. So, one person spoke about, and I think these words are on a slide later on, the fact that they participated in different in-person and online spaces that focused on the experiences of creators of colour in Scotland. And it's sort of highlighting how, geographies are entwined with the digital in this case, as well as, the in-person environment that was being dealt with. And rather than focusing on one key digital platform, so rather than this being a study of how people use YouTube or how people use Instagram or how people engage with Twitter, now known as X, we tried to keep the research interview questions relatively broad and to really hopefully open up a conversation that provided people with a chance to share about what they were engaging with, what they weren't, how they experienced it. And that provided us with an understanding of the fact that there was no sort of single go-to platform. There were some that seemed to lend themselves to certain experiences more so than others, but this was definitely not a case of looking into how one certain site does or doesn't support the experiences of creators of colour. So I've spoken a bit about the fact that the project was looking at how individuals both pursue paid work and address racism with the use of digital technology. So it might be useful for me at this point to speak briefly about digital racism. Of course, we recognise that racism does not exist because of digital technology, but digital technology and the political economies that are part of how digital technology is created and as a part of how it functions are very much connected to the specific ways that racism can occur in different digital spaces. So, as I've said, although racism is not the result of digital technology, it occurs in ways that are distinctly shaped by it. And this meant that we drew on quite a lot of work from critical race and digital studies, in addition to research on the platformization of work and the CCIs. We also drew a lot on the scholarship of Tressie McMillan-Cossum, who highlights that internet technologies are now a totalizing socio-political regime and should be central to the study of race and racism. And this is from an excellent article which is looking at the different ways that racial capitalism and the digital are very much entangled, and what that means in terms of how we approach research that hopefully meaningfully addresses matters to do with that. So before I move more towards speaking about the different clustered themes around digital community, algorithms, visibility, and so on, it's maybe useful for me to speak a little bit about erasure and obscurity in relation to all of this, both in terms of sort of how these topics have or haven't been studied before, and also in terms of how we try to move beyond positioning or viewing people's online experiences as wholly public or wholly private. So although there's, certainly a strong body of research on inequalities in the creative and cultural industries that we hope our work contributes to and is in dialogue with, the digital experiences of Black, Asian, and other people of colour in Britain have relatively seldom been the focus of work that explores these sorts of topics. And we feel it's vital that the experiences of such people aren't erased or obscured in broader research that might be intended to aid a more equitable future for people pursuing forms of paid work in the CCIs, but which might unfortunately miss dealing with some of the specifics of what we try to look at with this research project. In terms of thinking about erasure and obscurity and people's online experiences, and as I'll discuss in more detail shortly, we were mindful of the fact that sometimes digital disengagement might be discussed within the industry as though it is an issue to be remedied, an issue to be solved. There can be this idea that to be visible is essential, first of all, to pursue work in these sectors, and this idea that to be invisible or to be opaque or sort of obscure in some way is to always miss out on opportunities or exist in a space that is oppressive or inherently negative to the person experiencing that. Whereas I guess we're trying to complicate some of this and support work that already highlights the fact that for Black, Asian, and people of colour, forms of online obscurity or opaqueness can actually be a strategic way to try and protect a certain degree of peace, privacy, and even approach paid work in a way that pushes against an expectation to make oneself always sort of transparent, legible, visible to industries and institutions that have rarely had the interests of such people in mind. So here are a few examples of the sorts of questions that we asked during the research interviews. What uses, if any, have you made of digital technologies in your own career as a creative? For some people, digital and social media seems to offer a means for solidarity. Others have less positive views. Can you tell us about your views on this and about any relative experiences you've had? And of course, there's a lot of debate online about issues concerning creatives, including racism in the creative and cultural industries. Do you find digital and social media helpful or valuable in terms of debates on these and other issues? So, starting to think a bit more about those three sort of clustered thematic areas that I highlighted earlier on, and also bringing in again some of the words that people generously shared during their research interviews. It's worth me mentioning that in addition to the fact that we did this research at a time when people were dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, it also occurred at a time when we saw this sort of real surge in terms of national and global media coverage of anti-racist organising, the work of individuals involved in the Black Lives Matter movement or the movement for Black Life, and also just the mainstreaming of certain forms of discussion and discourse related to racism and addressing it in society, including in the context of certain professions, institutions, and workplace settings. So on that note, somebody spoke about feeling as though there's always been a sense of online community, but that this has, to them, obviously massively changed that particular year in light of the different ways that people had been responding to the deaths and murders of Black people around the world, particularly in the US in relation to forms of police brutality. And I say that because I think that it's helpful to reflect on the fact that what has or has not changed since we did this research. There are many discussions now about, being in this sort of post-racial reckoning period, and I say that with ambivalence and cynicism, but this post-racial reckoning period whereby certain organisations within industries, including the CCIs, made commitments at that time or made gestures to how they sought to address issues to do with racism, but have since sort of turned their back on that and have sort of moved away from it as though it was a moment or a trend. So thinking less so now about sort of how things are treated as a trend or a moment, and focusing more so on experiences of community that people discussed, key topics that were covered during the research interviews included experiences and differences that related to notions of networking and community building. And of course, these terms can sometimes be viewed in very similar ways and are even at times used interchangeably, but we feel as though, despite the fact they might both invoke feelings of belonging and connectedness and a sense of, shared values, and there are distinct differences between community building and networking. And these can include the fact that networking is sometimes a term that might be associated with notions of professionalism and institutionalization. And in addition to that, then notions of respectability that, of course, when we turn to work that deals with the racist underpinnings of ideas to do with respectability and civility, can be very oppressive in nature. So in other words, while nationally and institutionally affiliated networks for creators of colour were certainly commented on positively by some of the people that we interviewed, more informal experiences of digital community were also mentioned as providing stronger senses of solidarity, more of a grassroots feel. And a number of people spoke of whisper networks, these different informal channels of communication which involved people informing others of negative experiences or institutions or individuals to be wary of because of their experiences of racism and different forms of oppression in relation to them. And these words in this sort of teal coloured shape in the bottom right corner of the slides, these are the words of somebody who we interviewed, who spoke of Twitter having been the main route for them finding work and making contacts. They said there's a lot of hustle involved, a balancing act. I found that the strongest connections that I have are with artists and other creatives who I've connected with on Twitter. I have a very strong community, and it helps because personally I actually feel quite isolated in the real world. So again, we've got these ideas to do the real world coming through. And also this is another point that's, it's maybe helpful for me to pause and think about what has changed to do with this specific platform since then, and is this individual still even on Twitter? If they are, is that sense of community that they once felt was enabled by their use of Twitter even possible, given how the platform has changed and the different ways that has exacerbated forms of online harassment and abuse for many people? So that brings me to, a little bit more on Twitter before X. During these research interviews, Twitter was a platform that came up repeatedly, and the different examples that people spoke about, or the different experiences that were discussed, included experiences that really foreground what Meredith Clark highlights in research on the different ways that Black Twitter has involved discursive accountability praxis or different forms of calling out that have at times enabled Black people to express themselves, connect, come together and call out different issues of injustice without having to navigate the gatekeeping that can be a part of mainstream media. That said, this is sort of Twitter before X, and although many people spoke about it in somewhat sort of positive ways in relation to the potential to use the platform for forms of community and different forms of accountability practice, there were also many examples that point to the fact that there were, so many different forms of harassment and abuse that actually put people off even creating a platform on Twitter, or certainly put people off creating a platform that could be attributed to them. So there were pseudonymous and anonymous online experiences that people discussed as a way to try and navigate or mitigate the possibility of them facing online abuse and forms of trolling. Now, since then, as I said, a lot has changed, and whilst we've seen the emergence of new platforms or sort of attention suddenly being directed towards platforms that already exist, arguably you could say that there's still somewhat of a gap or a void that has been created by the ways that Twitter has and is changing. And although we've seen, some individuals speak about alternatives such as Blue Sky, it's an alternative that's been deemed perhaps promising in many different ways, the current invite-only model might prohibit the sense of open and accessible digital community that some of the people we spoke to felt was available to them through their use of Twitter. So to turn to the words of someone else again who we interviewed, there's a lot of Black artists on Twitter as well, because on social media, we have more dominance from what I've seen as opposed to in the CCI institutions. So you can't take the traditional gallery space away from us and now try and take social media away from us as well. And again, this is before the changes that we've seen happening to Twitter occurring. Even then there was this concern that the ephemeral nature of Twitter, sort of the fragility of what was possible at that time, could disappear at any given moment. So I spoke a moment ago about sort of the politics of notions of professionalism, or how ideas to do with networking are often connected to ideas to do with being a professional or part of an institution. And when we were doing this research, something that came through was the fact that different ideas to do with respectability and professionalism were often these sort of oppressive projections that people felt sort of pressure to respond to as part of how they tried to pursue paid work in the CCIs. So in one case, somebody spoke about the fact that they felt, they couldn't be, in their words, messy online in the same way that their white peers could. They said that, it felt as though if there was a white person in the creative and culture industries who maybe expressed some of what they expressed online, they'd be viewed as quirky or sort of, it would be endearing what they were doing. Whereas when it comes to the experience of, in this case, a South Asian woman, the online presence that she was cultivating, or the way she was simply being online was deemed as though it was at odds with ideas to do with professionalism and respectability. And this meant that people spoke about feeling forced to self-edit in an attempt to mitigate the prospect of being perceived as messy or difficult by predominantly white CCIs. Again, the words of someone else we spoke to, social media is meant to be your authentic self, and when you're further policing how you present yourself as a person of colour, striking a balance is difficult because you don't want to be seen as messy, unprofessional. I think if you're white, you're afforded a bit more quirky or a bit more sarcastic or a bit more offbeat. I couldn't get away with that attitude on an online space without being seen as difficult. And I think these words also highlight that although research sometimes signals that some people might feel able to express themselves more openly online than they might in certain offline situations, when we're dealing with these issues to do with ideas related to respectability and professionalism, there are many structural factors that can actually limit the extent to which it might feel possible to be open online as a creator of colour in Britain. So this slide is just a few more different words again that came through from the interviews. So to pick one of these out, somebody said, I'm constantly thinking about what I share and what I put out there because I don't think the world is kind of ready for people of colour to stand up for themselves as much as they want to. This signalling once more that forms of self-editing might occur in some cases, or in the absence of a sense of self-editing, people face these very punitive responses from institutions and from the industry. Another individual, a Black woman who spoke quite a lot about the intersections of racism, sexism, and misogyny, misogynoir, to draw on the work of Moya Bailey and Trudy. And this individual said, so we're Black women more visible. Certainly anything you say gets picked up on and can be used, or you can be targeted. I've had some trolling. And just one more speech bubble from this page. If you do work that is seen as racialized, you're not seen as somebody with a specialism, you're seen as somebody in a niche. And I feel as though these words really highlight again, or reiterate these issues to do with ideas that relate to professionalism and expertise and respectability. When is somebody's craft and creativity and work viewed as a specialism as opposed to a niche? And even when does the notion of niche become framed as something positive as opposed to something negative when we're dealing with the racialized nature of issues to do with inequality? So a few more slides before I bring this part of the session to a close, and hopefully that will leave a good amount of time for any questions and conversations. Although Instagram at that point anyway was, less associated than Twitter with certain forms of social and political commentary, people did speak about seeing the platform being increasingly used to actually speak more about issues to do with racism, including in the CCIs. So what we saw in one case was an individual speaking about the fact that, in previous years, you'd rarely see the sort of infographics that were doing the rounds on Instagram then. And some people were skeptical about this. Some individuals spoke of these sort of pastel palette colored infographics that felt very sort of light touch and actually very depoliticized, being reflective of the limitations of using a platform such as Instagram to address issues to do with racism. Whereby other people spoke about the fact that, people can post and share experiences or share information about issues on that platform and reach potentially a relatively broad and global audience, again, without having to sort of perhaps deal with an intermediary in the form of a CCI institution to get that message out there. Somebody said that, although they were dealing with an organization who claims to sort of care about issues to do with racism and even had a dedicated Instagram for people of color, they seemed disinterested in often picking up the paid work of people of color pitching to them. So I share that example because I think it speaks to some of these tensions between what might be visible, in this case, what an organization might project in terms of their interest in addressing issues to racism and supporting people of color, and then the reality of what's happening away from that platform, and the fact that in this case, the organization did not seem to be substantiating the claims they were making about being serious when it comes to addressing these sorts of issues. In another case, we spoke with an actor who was really quite doubtful about the potential benefits of using Instagram to address racism. They spoke of the fact that people shouldn't be dying, and people are dying, and then you'll see people sort of posting content about it with these sort of cutified or pretty images that are shared a million times on Instagram. So there was this sort of allusion to the trivialization of these issues because of the sort of clickbait logic that can underpin some of these platforms. And someone spoke about feeling as though they're in a constant flux in terms of trying to figure out what to do with their social media. If they want to share all these insightful things about race within the industry, then there's always a struggle of who's looking at it, who in the industry isn't ready to see it yet. To start to sort of wind things down in terms of sharing these slides, I won't read through everything here, particularly because this is also dealing with, again, the forms of abuse and harassment, and just the hostile online environments that people can encounter. But as the visuals on this perhaps even allude to, certainly no matter the opportunities for people to find or forge community or pursue paid work online, this was always still in the context of potentially encountering vitriolic harassment, potentially finding that they're being sort of surveilled by institutions, and really dealing with spaces that are far from being safe. So while some people who we spoke to discussed the significant role of digital platforms in creating and sharing their work, others spoke of how they actively disengage from digital spaces to protect their privacy, peace, and even what they feel is a protection of their professional prospects. One individual spoke of seeing people now having more agency online, and in some cases, people seem to be respecting that. They said, obviously, you get some people that are trolling, which is part of the online community, but I think that people are comfortable now more so than ever in speaking about their truth. I feel as though, depending on who you ask, the extent to which people feel that is or isn't true can vary considerably. And I also feel as though it's worth reflecting on the fact that it depends on if someone's sort of speaking their truth to a public that is somewhat private to an extent, within a certain community or network space, as opposed to speaking publicly about issues to do with racism in a very open and candid way that certainly is very rarely going to result in them being unequivocally respected and supported. So the relationship between digital technology and structural oppression certainly extends beyond people's use of social media. And as was discussed during the research interviews, digital platforms can aid vital whisper networks. So, one person spoke of the real value in these whisper networks and saying that these whisper networks are not just about abusive work practices. You'll also hear about people warning you of sexual abusers or emotional abusers. And in this case, it's important to be mindful of the fact that when we are looking at the intersections of racism, sexism, and misogyny, when Black women are speaking out about forms of abuse, the responses to them are often punitive and discriminatory responses, which means that although whisper networks are certainly no solution and do not address those forms of oppression, they can provide some degree of support or some small sense of safety within certain situations. So overall, our research highlights tensions between the pressures and experiences of digital self-branding practices, building on scholarship on inequalities in the CCIs and the relationship between digital platforms and racism. We find a marked ambivalence in the reported experiences of Black, Asian, and other people of colour working in Britain's CCIs. As I've continually said throughout today, it would be fascinating to perhaps, expand upon this sort of research in this current moment, now that we have seen some of the platforms that we spoke of significantly shift, and now that some people have made some very big moves away from certain platforms or have adopted approaching posting on social media in a more sort of casual and less frequent way. Social media plays a central part in some people's experiences of paid work and community participation in the CCIs, but it has a more peripheral role in other people's career trajectory, forms of solidarity, and organising efforts. And again, this is always entangled with different issues to do with racism and the ways that is interconnected with other forms of inequality and oppression, such as colorism, homophobia, classism, transphobia, and ableism. Finally, the convergence of creativity and activism is one that creators of colour may try to resist, or at least attempt to make meaningful, such as through certain forms of digital presence and self-promotion that platforms and the CCIs encourage. However, we also feel it's important that the online content and commentary of Black and Asian people and other people of colour should not be assumed as an inherently activist, anti-racist, or resistant. And certainly the burden of responsibility to address racism and issues to do with oppression should not lie with such people. So to understand and support the digital experiences of Black, Asian, and other people of colour in the CCIs, it's important to move beyond a binary framing of digital platforms as either inherently good or bad. And here, of course, we're echoing a wide body of work on exactly these sorts of issues. And that means it's important to grapple with the specific affordances, functions, and norms of certain sites and sectors, which are constantly shifting and changing. So sort of close with these words from a research interview. It's constantly that type of war of, do I put myself in that place emotionally and know that I'm going to have to fight for something here, because it's not just my opinion versus your opinion when it comes to race and racial issues. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions or any reflections that people would like to share.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Francesca. That's, as always, a very provocative and rich contribution. Can I, anybody who has questions to ask or comments to make, you're very welcome to put your hand up and I can call on you directly to ask those. Or if you prefer, you can put them in the chat and I can read them out as you like. While we're just waiting for some people to collect their thoughts and comments, I think, first of all, Francesca, I thought it was absolutely excellent. And I'm really pleased that we've been able to help support you in the first round of the Innovation Fund with this work you've been doing, because, a lot of your work from the years we've known each other has been really at the forefront of some of these issues. I mean, some of the things we talked about when we were putting Digit together 5 years ago was extraordinary how relatively little at that time there was about racial discrimination and digital media, or some of the issues you're discussing with 5 or 7 years ago. There was a handful of work compared to what's today, and your work's really been part of that massive growth in the importance of it. Secondly, I think there's also conceptually, there's some really interesting contribution here about it's not a binary either or outcome. It's racist or it's not racist. It's an opportunity or it's a form of oppression. I think you really capture that agency of the digital is in a process of being made, and it's made by different types of people. So I just think that insight is extremely valuable in capturing the real diversity of things that you look at. And I suppose also the question I'm going to ask you, I'll get to the point, is maybe I think it would be quite useful for some people in the audience, maybe they already know, I think, to discuss the concept of misogynoir a little bit more, like where did this concept come from? Because I think one of the things that's lacking in these debates on the digital evolution are what are the concepts we can use to try and capture what you've presented here. It's quite difficult. So, for example, in our own work, we were looking at the concept of fractious connections. So how are people connected through digital tools? And to what extent is that a cooperative relationship or an exploitative one, or one that's contested? That's a concept we're working on. And I'm not sure what quite the concept might be here that would be useful, and maybe whether it might help the audience if we talk a bit about misogynoir. Where did that concept come from? Because that is a new concept. It hasn't been put together in that form before. So maybe that's the easiest way to segue into a kind of response to how could you, is there a way of conceptually presenting this idea here? I don't know, how we move it on, and then I'll take up some questions. Is that too?
Guys, I'll give that a go. I think there's a bunch of different questions there, so I'll try and sort of address them piece by piece. So I guess the first question, yes, so the concept of misogynoir, that's a concept that relates to the phenomenal work of Dr. Moya Bailey, and that also includes brilliant work that is well, there are lots of different sources that I can highlight in the chat if it's helpful, but so there is the book Misogynoir Transformed by Bailey, and there's also a brilliant article by Bailey and Trudy on misogynoir and on the origins of that conceptualizing and the work that they've both done around that, including in relation to how that concept has sometimes been sort of decontextualized and has resulted in forms of erasure in terms of the origins of the term and who's done the work of developing that concept. And the concept, certainly the best thing that you can do in terms of wanting to find out more about it is read work by Bailey and Trudy. But I would say, to try and offer a very brief explanation now, the concept encompasses the specific forms of oppression that Black women face. So thinking about the impacts of the interconnections of anti-Black racism, sexism and misogyny, and how that will result in the very particular ways, for example, that Black women are responded to, whether that is in the context of educational settings, the workplace, healthcare environments. So the work of Bailey includes extensive research on medical racism and looking at misogynoir in relation to that. And maybe to just provide an example in the context of Britain, we can think about that with regards to the appalling statistics around the deaths that can occur in relation to Black women's experiences of pregnancy and labour. So that's sort of a little bit around about misogynoir as a concept and the scholars and scholarship to engage with for anybody who's wanting to learn more about it. And in terms of our project, I would say it's not that our research project is about sort of a single specific concept, but it's maybe more around how can we both understand and conceptualize these issues to do with the experiences of Black, Asian and people of colour in the creative and culture industries in a way that accounts for the sort of the specific ways that digital technology and digital culture and the political economy that all that is a part of shapes what's going on. So in a way it's less about us coming up with a specific set concept, because I'm always sort of I guess I always question the extent to which a single concept can encompass all of what's being looked at, and instead it's more about how can we maybe both bridge some of the gaps between discussions in certain disciplinary spaces, be that media studies, studies of the CCIs, studies of digital technology, and also how can we do that in a way that then draws out both some of the similarities and differences between the experiences of Black, Asian and other people of colour in these spaces. So in our article in the Sociological Review, we write quite a bit about ambivalence in this particular case. Ambivalence is a term and a concept, certainly not new, and it's certainly not ours, but we're conceptualizing experiences in a way that hopefully pushes back against any notion of, you know, digital culture as being simply brilliant or simply awful for people trying to pursue paid work in these spaces.
I think you actually hit the nail really right on the head there. That is actually a very big challenge. So for those people who have to go, there's some links in the chat from Rita Garcia Lusofona about some work she's been doing there. So you can pick up those in the chat. And from Margarita, sorry, you've got to go as well. First of all, before I say anything else, is there anybody else who'd like to raise their hand or have questions they'd like to ask? Because I've got loads, but I don't want it to just be Francesca and Jackie talking. So please feel free if you want to raise any questions or comments or anything like that, it's fine. Okay, while I'm waiting for it, I think you really hit the nail on the head with this ambivalence, because it's very easy. There's a clear literature out there of it's all dreadful, or it's all the sunny uplands. Life is never really like that. And in a way, some of the work we were doing with SASE last year or two is trying to look on the work from Mark Granavetta about the strength of weak ties. So how do people get jobs? You know, that work is from the 1970s. Is it having a close-knit community that provides you resilience against the kind of effects of some forms of capitalism? Or is it actually having a very broad network that will allow you access to a more diverse range of people, which is what might enhance your social capital in the sense of getting access, for example, to paid work? And Granavetta in that work really tried to talk about ambivalence or paradoxes, because things that are strong sometimes can be weak and vice versa. And that's what he's trying to get at, trying to explain why people get particular types of jobs. And I think your work is fantastic in really illustrating, on one hand, the digital it reduces the barriers to publishing yourself in whatever form it is. It can do. But it also comes with it this new forms of oppression that were not as visible before in the same way, or it amplifies racism. And I think we don't have to look very far, do we? If we go to the COVID inquiry and just see how other members of staff at Number 10 were discussed in terms of their sex and what they wore and their behaviour, it was actually shocking how people thought they were using digital technologies to communicate about other members of staff they didn't think they were being observed, and yet they would never say those things in a public space, but they thought by putting it on WhatsApp, it's fine. And it kind of revealed what people actually think, but might not say in a physically public space. So what I'm trying to say there is, on one hand, you have that opening up, and the other hand, you have an opening up of really horrible opinions that you don't want to see. And that's what I think some of your work really captures very, very well, that tension between where direct racism, people won't express quite so bad apart from the EDL, but there's a whole load of other things that are going on that sometimes these digital technologies illustrate that we didn't see so much in the past. But and I just think it's really hard. A challenge for us theoretically is really to try and capture what's the conceptual framework that would allow us the building blocks to be able to capture or discuss those in a way that we could move forward with what could be done about it, like that combination between structural oppression and inequality and the ability of agency or activists to do something about it. How do we capture those tensions, I think, is what your work really illustrates. But yeah, maybe, sorry, Deborah, you've got your hand up. Please go ahead. Because we can have more of a conversation as well, not just I have to ask questions, please.
Thanks, Francesca. That was a superb presentation. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on, you mentioned the politics of professionalism and how the notion of respectability and professionalism is impacted by intersecting inequalities. And I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little, please, because I was interested in that. Thank you. Yeah,
sure. Thanks very much. And I think that maybe sort of nicely relates to the earlier discussion around sort of the importance of there being different concepts that are drawn on and sort of that wider conceptual framework. So on that note, I'd say some of the different strands of literature that we turned to included literature on respectability politics. You know, that particularly in the US, focuses on the experiences of Black American people. So thinking about how the intersections of white supremacy and capitalism, racial capitalism, has throughout history resulted in these notions of respectability that really sort of uphold middle class values, and often in ways that sort of reinforce stereotypical ideas about the so-called sort of good minority, to sort of provide an example. And in relation to our research project, what that meant was we were thinking about the fact that when it comes to how people might be online or present themselves online, the experience of one of the research interview participants I spoke about earlier on, who said, as a South Asian woman online, she was aware that even her white woman peers might be able to express critical thoughts or views on certain things without facing essentially the racism that she might face in the same sort of situation. So this also connects to sort of very race and gendered ways that ideas about who is angry sort of come through in society. You know, several people might utter the same statement, but because of who they are and racist, sexist, classist perceptions of anger or what it means to express discontent, someone might be responded to very differently in comparison to someone else. And I think this also relates to the specifics of forms of online surveillance. So maybe, although this is slightly tangential to our particular research project, I think it's maybe a helpful example. But when we think about conversations to do with, for example, Prevent in the UK, or even sort of recent media coverage around which academics are most likely to be surveilled in terms of social media, you know, academics commenting on particular issues to do with injustice, often to do with matters related to racism, sexism, and so on, it highlights that who tends to be viewed as sort of a deviant, to think about work on moral panic and so on, is impacted by these intersections to do with inequality. So it's not just what's being said, it's who's saying it, and whether or not who they are tends to be viewed as an other that is a disruptive cause for concern, as opposed to being aligned with the dominant culture and the status quo, which in the case of the CCIs typically is a predominantly middle class white space, often with men in the most senior and well-paid roles.
Deborah, did you want to come back on that, or? It's interesting, the concept of respectability from that North American literature is like, go back to the 19th century, the deserving, undeserving, poor. It's a slightly formulated, and there are deserving or respectable Black and Asian communities, and there are those that are really wild and not respectable. I think that's very interesting. Is there anybody else who'd like to have a question or comment they'd like to make? Maybe Francesca, I'll take this opportunity. Could you tell us a little bit about what your future plans are? Because you mentioned the work you're doing in race in the marketplace and your international network. So it'd just be quite interesting to see how you're taking some of this work forward.
Sure. So my future plans is to sleep for as much of the rest of the year as possible, because we're at the point in the year where I think everything should stop. But some of the research and some of the work that I'm working on includes ongoing work with a person that I've been collaborating with for around about 7 or 8 years, a good friend and incredible writer, organizer and curator, Layla Roxanne Hill. And we've been doing work that focuses on Black life and Black history in Scotland. So we co-authored a book, Black Out Here, Black Lives in Scotland, with Bloomsbury, which was published last year. And this year we worked in collaboration with various people to co-create a graphic novel and an animation. And the graphic novel is actually illustrated by Chris Manson, who's the person that illustrated the artwork for the report that I spoke a bit about today. And the animation was wonderfully produced and created by Leeds Animation Workshop, including Oren Rose O'Sullivan. And as part of that work, we tried to focus in particular on the experiences of children and young people. So although we hope the graphic novel might be of interest to everyone, it's particularly with children and young people in mind, and it's available in Scots, English and Scottish Gaelic, freely available online, and all print copies are freely available too. We've just got a another small grant to support some of that work. So we're in the early stages of thinking about how to continue that, and that's really focused on dreaming. So it's been called Blackout here, Dreams Was, and that's in part because we're conscious that oftentimes conversations to do with Black life and history can be framed through, again, binaries of sort of trauma and violence, or sort of unabashed joy and a sense of complete freedom. And we're saying, you know, it's everything all at once, and that includes the fact that Black Scottish history is about the everyday. It's about how people dream. It's about moments with your family, with your friends. And yeah, we're hoping to continue to work on that, and to also bring in the Welsh context as well, where I've lived for about 4.5 years, and where my family's Nigerian and North Welsh, for a little bit of background context there. And beyond that, the future, I just hope to get to work with awesome people and do exciting things that feel free of some of the sorts of constraints that we spoke about earlier on, and also hopefully going some way to help address some of those sorts of issues to do with oppression too.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you back, and so the rest of us, and many people have had to leave the chat, as said as well, because I think, like I said at the beginning, you're doing some really fantastic work at the real frontier of research in this area, both conceptually and methodologically. So it's just great to see the rich work you're producing. So I look forward to seeing more in the future. It'll be great. So on behalf of everybody, can I thank you very much for giving us a really interesting Digit debate today. And can I also remind anybody who might like to come, our last one of the year will be next week, where we have counter-hegemonic neoliberalism, making sense of EU platform regulation, with Philipp Stab from the Einstein Center for Digital Futures in Berlin. And that will be hosted together with my colleague, Steve Rov. So I hope you'll come and enjoy that pre-Christmas Digit debate. So thank you very much to all of you for coming, and look forward to seeing you next week. All the best. Thank you very much. And thank you, Francesca, from all of us. Bye-bye now.